Lyons is based at York University. His role in the Spirit of the Serpent team revolves around his immense understanding of physics and how it applies to the laws of nature, but his interest in ancient sites dates from school days.
I guess like most things, that one gets into these things almost by default. It just so happened that the family lived in Wiltshire, no further than a quarter of a mile away from what was Woodhenge. And that's not too far away, as many people know, from Stonehenge. And so, as a schoolboy, I was able to cycle around Aylesbury and lean my cycle against the stones at Stonehenge, which of course is no longer possible. And therefore, this provided me with a very early interest in the whole of the Neolithic scenario. It was when I moved into the academic world I began to realise that lots of the things that I had been doing for very many years, in fact, tied in with my hobbies quite remarkably. And in fact, in the last 10 years, let's say from 1990 or so onwards, I then really started to look at the emerging ideas that were happening at the time in physics and still very much part of physics today. That is the idea of really looking at consciousness being part of the whole world of physics. This had never really been inside physics for 300 years or so, but now people are taking a much wider perspective. And it's really that aspect that's really driven me to bring together my dowsing interests with the world of modern science. If one looks at ancient cultures, then one finds the ideas that this universal energy field that we live in was very well known to, say, the ancient Chinese, who called it feng shui, and that is really the name for wind and water. And that gives you instantaneously the idea that the whole thing is to do with the flow of some sort of fluid. And I guess it took me 30 years before that particular key point really sunk in, because I already had, as an aerodynamicist, a lot of this toolkit really available to apply to this sort of scenario. And when I started to look at what people had done in this area from the research point of view, I found that virtually nothing had been done at all. No modern ideas of fluid flow had been applied to the idea of subtle energies, and therefore here was a completely new field of research, and that's what really started me off on the last 10 to 15 years of work. When we talk about energies, we're talking using a term that was really invented in the 19th century, but people were very well aware of effects upon them and the movement of things, and in common practice the word energy was around for quite some time. And when we're talking about stone circles, people use it in a common everyday format. What I've tried to do from the scientific point of view is apply a true scientific perspective of what we mean by energy to the stone circle scene. Well, we don't see this because it is in fact what we call a subtle energy. That is, it's operating at very, very fine levels such that it's not visible to our normal senses. Perhaps you like to call it a sixth sense. I always use the term fifth and a half sense because it's something that you can, in a way, get your hands on, and in another way, you cannot see it. But there are some people who still retain this ability to see this flow of energy. And in fact, around various stones, one can see this energy manoeuvring from the stones very much in the same way that smoke rises from a chimney. And this vortex-type flow is something that's been known since very ancient times. And it's really the analysis of that sort of flow that's the key to this whole scene. I'm totally convinced the ancients, in their very quiet, secluded world, judged from our perspective, would have been able to see it on almost a daily basis. And if you look at cultures today, certain cultures, Aborigines, for example, or the Hopi Indians, they still claim to have this capability to see these natural earth energies, as we call them. And in fact, these earth energies, the shapes that we see at stones, from stone circles, really are no more than you can see in the sky, because it is really the sort of motion you see when you see clouds moving around. Indeed, if you look at the patterns of clouds and then start to look at the patterns in the ground of all these earth energies, you find the same underlying physics in the two things. It really is quite remarkable. And this is something we've discovered in the last 5 years. Well, stone circles are positioned in very specific points on the Earth. I talked about these patterns of energies in the ground, and in fact they're essentially lines running north, south, east and west, but they're not straight lines. They're these wonderful curly patterns, curlicue type patterns. But essentially, stone circles are always built at the crossover of these energy lines. And indeed, it's true for medieval churches as well. Right until about the 17th century, churches were still built in precisely this very specific way. And at the crossover of these energy lines, you always find them associated with underground water. And if you can analyse in great detail what a stone circle does, it's the combination of the stones together with the underground water that generates all these wonderful patterns of energy, and indeed lots of effects on humans as well. So we're not just talking here about the energy on its own, we're talking about the energy emerging from the ground in a particular area of the ground, which is what we call a chakra pattern on the ground, very much the same way that one has chakra patterns in the bioenergy fields of humans. We are just like the Earth. We are built just like the Earth from the energy point of view. And in fact, it is this interaction of this energy with our cells that gives us the second effect of stone circles. This is not just the geophysics, it's also the biophysics. And so when we start to analyse stone circles, we're not just looking at it from the archaeological point of view. Now we have to consider it from both the geophysical point of view as well as a biophysical point of view. And so we're bringing together the interaction of the energy, these earth energies, on the humans themselves. So this is why humans have a response to it from a conscious point of view, but it also affects the physical body in many ways. In particular, it is now possible to not only measure changes in brainwave patterns, which are a neurological correlate, you might say, of consciousness effects, but it's also possible to measure changes, for example, in the hormonal level in individuals. And the changes in the hormones are truly a reflection of the interaction of these earth energies with the biophysics of the person involved. One always talks about this energy being electromagnetic in nature, and in fact the first attempt to explain dowsing generally was on the basis of electromagnetic theory. But in fact, when you start to analyse it, it's not sufficient in its own right. It does not explain everything. You have to look a little bit at the history of how our understanding, man's understanding of electromagnetics developed, which again was classical 19th century physics. And it was really started to evolve in the 1860s thereabouts. But the original ideas were somewhat untidy, and it took about 25 years to, let's say, clean up this whole idea of electromagnetics. And that's the version, the cleaned up version is the version we teach to our students today, and they're absolutely superb for designing mobile phones and electrical equipment and things like that. But what's happened is, in this tidying up process of the original electromagnetic theory, we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. In fact, when you look back to the original theories of Clerk Maxwell, who really developed this from a mathematical point of view, he had all sorts of other parameters in his equations. And it's these other parameters that we are now investigating in great detail, because these appear to have quite a lot of linkage with the sort of effects that we're really talking about. They appear to have certainly linkage with consciousness and biophysics. During the 1990s, when physicists started to look again at this whole theory of consciousness, which hadn't really been studied for about 100 years, to be perfectly honest, new ideas in this wonderful field of quantum theory, which are rather obscure and rather difficult to understand, started to be applied to possible biological systems. And in fact, it seemed at the time to start to explain one or two effects in perhaps how the brain might possibly work, in terms of how information might jump across neurons within the brain. And in fact, since then, during the 1990s, a whole new range of experiments have taken place. And the crucial one here, for all of the stuff that we're talking about now, is this way in which quantum particles, once having been together and then being separated, still appear to be linked to one another. In other words, if you have two particles together, and it doesn't really matter what subatomic particles you're talking about, when they were originally entangled, use the correct expression, then you separate them and you do something to one particle, the other particle responds almost immediately. But in fact, virtually immediately. We can't tell the difference. These two appear to be one particle, although they're separated. And this is a quantum effect called non-locality. And it's this sort of way in which consciousness works. And the everyday description of this is perhaps how one might talk about identical twins and how they have very common ideas and do things at the same time and think about things in the same way. They're at one time being linked together as one cell and being separated, apparently independently, but then they seem to operate as one despite the distance apart. And this quantum non-local effect is something that we're applying very seriously to these ideas in consciousness. So it is really a descriptor of the mind. Such that now we're talking about, at least modern science is talking about the brain being the mind. And there's an awful lot of confusion about this brain and the mind. But what we are looking at now is the idea that this is the brain, but in fact the mind is truly out there. And this is a very ancient idea, and it is coming back again, that this universe in which we live is in fact a mind in its own right, and we are just one element within that universe. The idea that there was a universal field, is, as I said, is a very ancient idea. And indeed this kept going as a concept well into the 19th century. And it was only really in the beginning of the 20th century when we started to look at new ideas in so-called relativity theory, modern ideas of gravity, that the equations of Einstein suggested that perhaps we didn't need the idea of some universal ether or some universal field. In fact, you do not need that concept to be able to solve his equations. And therefore the idea that this universal field existed fell out of fashion. But lots of things happened in the quantum theory field which suggested that we do in fact always have what we call a zero-point energy field or a vacuum field. It goes under all sorts of different names, but there is a universal field there. And this is what I call the modern quantum idea of an ether. And it's this quantum field that the consciousness of the individual interacts with, and that's the current model that we're using. Well, the key thing about this field is that, in fact, it is a self-organising field. What I mean by that is patterns of nature emerge. So if you look at a flower, for example, and you see all these wonderful petals, 6- and 5-fold petals, you find those same patterns, 6 5-fold patterns, geometrical patterns, in the earth. If you start to look at things on a global basis, you're talking about shapes of things to do with the solar system, you still find the same numbers there. Or you can go to galaxies and you still find the same numbers there. And you can talk about some of the modern ideas in which the universe is expanded from the Big Bang. All of these same numbers still emerge, such that the whole of the universe looks very much like the idea of Russian dolls, whereby we have one universal shape, and we can put a smaller version inside that, and then a smaller version inside that, and a smaller version inside that one, such that we can start with really big stuff and end up with the small scale stuff. So, and this fitting of patterns with inside patterns, being essentially the same pattern, is what we call fractals. And this fractal geometry we now know applies to the whole of nature. And in fact we're beginning to understand how this applies as a concept even to the ideas of consciousness and thought, such that it truly is a universal pattern. But when we're talking about other shapes and patterns we find in stone circles, the key one is perhaps the spiral. Everybody finds spirals. And once you have a spiral, it has a true mathematical shape. In fact, one of the key patterns you find at stone circles, believe it or not, has precisely the same structure as the DNA molecule, with precisely the same angles in it. And when the whole structure of the DNA genome, the whole structure of the DNA molecule was finally worked out, it was discovered to be precisely the same as the 64 hexagram code of the I Ching that the Chinese had invented 5000 BC. And it's these patterns that we're now starting to find emerging in our studies of consciousness itself. And we can use dowsing to enable us to generate these self-same numbers. Dowsing has always been thought of as something of a qualitative type activity, but in fact it isn't. There's an awful lot of quantitative data in dowsing that really reveals the equations of physics within it. Mainstream science at the moment is still some way away from accepting these ideas, but what is quite surprising is that as I talk to more and more people, lots more individuals are beginning to latch on to these connections. And my gut feeling is in the next generation, a new set of graduates will in fact adopt a totally different attitude, and I think will begin to absorb some of these ideas. And in fact the true linkages throughout science will finally be brought together, and that doesn't really matter whether we're talking about matter itself or whether we're talking about mind. We should begin to understand that essentially from a structural point of view they're all the same thing.